Hello,
How's
my
it going?
name is James Wise. I'm from Virginia, but originally I'm British also. And I have two questions for you today. My first question is, what was the reason why you moved to the United States? What was the main reason?
So the main reason at the time was I did computer science at college in England, and you only ever do one subject with your university there. So it's basically all I was qualified to do was do software engineering, even though I didn't really want to. And so always knew I wanted to move to the US at some point to experience living there. So it was just a good opportunity for me at the time. I didn't really see myself living here long term. But once I moved here and truly experienced what it's like to be here, what it's like to be an American, I can't ever see myself leaving.
I agree, thank you. And my second question is, how did you adapt to the new culture and environment?
I mean, I think everyone in all history has adapted. I think we are meant to adapt. I mean, the fact we don't live in caves anymore shows that we're pretty good at adapting. People move all the time, so I think I would put that back and say, like, you should expect to adapt. I think when people get lazy and want things not to change, that's almost a bad thing. I think conservatives are often labeled as just wanting to conserve everything as it is, and I think we're naturally developmental beings. And so I think you should just embrace it, take it as the norm. Be surprised if you don't have to adapt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sarah. I'm from the Central Valley, which is here in California. And my question is, why do people who blame the government not realize it's their fault because they are the ones giving their freedom to the politicians?
I think a lot of it is because people hate looking in the mirror and realizing they're at fault. Like, I do it, we all do it. It's very easy to blame someone else. It's like a natural human reaction to want to blame someone else. And so it's the just logical extension of that, where if you can blame the government because you have handed power to them, then you can really just take responsibility off your own shoulders, which is really my entire argument, which is we should be taking responsibility at the lowest level and not looking just to some guy in Washington to fix it all. And so I think, again, it's just a natural human condition that we like to blame others for our misfortunes. It's like blaming God for the weather or blaming God for being late when you left late. You know, it's things like that. I think we just need to be looking ourselves in the mirror and taking responsibility at every single element of our lives.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question. How much of the problems in the U.S. in your opinion, have to do with how our culture is wanting the short-term comfort instead of long-term gain? And how big is that impact? And then how could we try to fix that?
Well, I think it really connects to what I'm trying to say, which is looking at things as a two-sided coin, and that everyone wants short-term comfort without thinking about the consequences of that short-term comfort. And so if you look at things, it's like the experiment of teaching children, if you wait for something, you'll get more candy, but if you have it immediately, you'll get less. I think that kind of level has been taken out of people where they want just short-term everything, whether it's be on your phone, you want short-term gratification. And I think there's almost a level of immorality there where you don't really work for anything. Everyone wants things immediately, but we also look to elected officials who are willing to give us those things immediately. And so really it's up to us to reject that. When someone is trying to promise you something today, really realizing that most of these promises don't go anywhere, and we are at fault for allowing them to trick us with that. And so you can blame the person trying to trick you, but you can also blame yourself for allowing ourselves to be constantly tricked.
How can we try to affect others to help them get out of that mentality?
I think it's just encouraging people to grow up. I think it's going to be very, very hard, honestly, because these things are hard. Like, none of these things are easy. None of these things feel good. It's like wanting to be stronger but not wanting to go to the gym. And if you want to take more responsibility for your life, it's going to be harder. You might have, say, less money than you were if you were just getting a payout from the government. But we need to be thinking as ourselves as what we can do as individuals to help everyone around us and how to grow as individuals but also as communities, and looking to someone else for help with every single problem. And so I think a lot of that on a small community level is just trying to affect change by being an example. It's very hard to force someone else not to do what's easy, but if they see you doing it, I think there's a lot of people who would like to be better. And so I think if you can show a good example, that's one of the best ways to affect change.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Miles Anderson from Kansas, and a question I had was, so you mentioned in your speech about how European nations and Canada and other just westernized nations have more controlling policies, especially with regards to guns and speech. Why do you think that is? Is that like, why do you think America is so unique? Do you think that's just because something the founders did, or do you think it's like more of an attitude of our culture? What do you think that is?
I think part of it is obviously the founders. I think a lot of it is just luck of who is the leader at the time something happens. Like if we had someone like Joe Biden around at the time of the founding, it might not have gone so well. But I also think you've got to think about what is the United States. And fundamentally, it's a revolutionary country that was built on revolt and built on rejecting a higher power that was, across the sea. And you've got other European nations that are not that. Yes, there's been a lot of war, but Europe as a continent has been incredibly established in terms of the style of civilization that's been there. Like in the UK, you've got over 1,000 years of common law and things like that have come in place where the idea of what the police does and the idea of personal responsibility isn't central. And so I think that's the key difference, and that's why you see the United States so unique, is that there are very few countries that are built on a revolution that have actually turned out well for them. So if you look at other revolutions, they're usually much bloodier and also just collapsing on themselves because they're not based on the kind of fundamental principles that the founders put forward.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hayden Carter and I go to Academy of Our Lady of Peace in San Diego. And so I know you talked about with freedom you can't do anything. So how does freedom tie into morality?
So I think you've just got to decide what morality is, and I think that's sometimes where like faith in a higher power comes in. Because if you don't have a faith in a higher power, then really there is no morality. There's no reason to do something good. You often hear atheists say, like, oh, it doesn't really matter if I don't believe there's something else after life, or I don't think there's something above me. I can do good things for the right reason. Nothing has any meaning unless there's that higher power. And so freedom, I think, it's more to do, again, with the responsibility aspect of if you believe we're put on this earth by something else, whatever you believe God to be, some higher power, then you have a responsibility to that to live in a way that, at least in Judeo-Christian principles, we've been led to live. And so I think then it's more the responsibility to use your freedom in that way. I don't think morality can be just this mutually exclusive item. I think it has to be motivated by something else. Because morality is like a set of rules based on a higher power. You can't just have morality on its own.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Emily Levy. I'm from Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm homeschooled. And my question for you is, you were talking about how we need to take responsibility. What are some specific steps that we as teenagers can take to take responsibility for our own freedom?
Well, I think it's first is not looking to other people to solve your problems and to make decisions based on what you want out of life. So I speak to a lot of college students mainly, and a lot of them are in college and they cannot answer to me why they're doing it. Like, oh, I just thought this was what I'm doing. I'm not the kind of person who's going to tell someone not to go to college, but I think in terms of taking responsibility for your life, the best thing is to make every single decision an intentional one. Like, I'm going to college to study X because I want to achieve Y, or not going to college because you want to take a different route. I think those kind of things are really important. Those are very, very concrete things you as an individual can do. That has nothing to do with anyone else. It's just you making the best decision for you. And I think really that's the main piece of advice I have for anyone, whether in high school or college, is just very important years. Like, time is a very limited resource. And your early years in education and then work choices you make are incredibly important for what direction you go. And just making sure that you're planning ahead. You're not just doing things like college for the point of going to college. Because then you're breeding this generation of people who, especially in the US, where you do a bachelor's where probably like a third of what you're studying in your major is not actually that relevant. And so then you come out, I've got to do a master's to specialize so I can go and get a job. And then you just have this cycle of people who aren't even, they're in their 30s by the time they get out. So you can definitely get a leg up on those people if you decide when you're sort of 16, 17, 18 what you want to do or what direction you want to go. Then that's a really major thing you could do.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Maddie Strazzeri. I live in San Diego, and I go to the Academy of Our Lady of Peace. And as the granddaughter of immigrants, and I know that you're an immigrant, as you said in your speech, I was wondering how the freedoms in America are different or similar to that in the UK, and how have our American freedoms and ideals affected you as an immigrant?
I think really the major one I'm going to talk about in answer to this is gun rights. So when I moved to the US, I'd shot a shotgun like a couple of times, maybe an air rifle at like a friend's house, but like nothing serious. And I was one of the many people, both Democrats and people who don't live in the US, of why would you need a gun? Like, I thought it was almost kind of a silly culture in a way. And the more I got to know, for example, like the agricultural community in the Central Valley in California, like went shooting with like family and friends and things like that. And also just looking at things like crime in agricultural areas where you don't have the police on your doorstep and you have to take responsibility for your own safety. And so then it kind of clicked in my mind of what freedom is. It's the freedom to really stand on your own 2 feet, which in places like the UK, you really cannot. Like the idea, like stand your ground is laughed at in the UK. Like people go to jail for fighting back against people who break into their home, for example, which is just the opposite of what it should be. But once you're used to it, in all these countries, they're so used to it over really hundreds of years that the idea of changing it is just so ridiculous. And so moving here, that's one of the things that was really like a sort of light bulb moment for me in a way of just realizing that there is deep level of thought behind these freedoms that the rest of the world kind of scoffs at. And I think once you understand that, you understand conservatism as a whole much better.
Thank you.
Hey, and really appreciate you coming out here. My question for you today was, there's a quote by William Tytler, who was a government philosopher, and he said that civilizations or republics can only last for about 3 centuries. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that? And if so, how do we combat the fall of a civilization?
I think it's hard because we have, in terms of the span of the globe, we have an incredibly small lens on history in terms of human civilization. And so that might be true in terms of what we've seen of like great empires falling. But we also live in a time where things like technology are accelerating at a rate they never were. And so it might not even be that long in terms of how civilizations can suffer. I think in terms of combating it, I think we need to hold on incredibly strongly to core fundamental values that people like Joe Biden are trying to just erode. Because the reason a lot of things that are falling apart in the world right now is squarely because of Joe Biden, and he's just ignoring what makes America great on the foreign stage, which is taking responsibility for the promises you've made in the past and standing up to bullies effectively. Like there is a reason that Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then waited 8 years for Donald Trump to be in and out of office, and then when Biden was in office. And so I think if we want to avoid the collapse of civilization that we've seen in other places, we have to hold on to the principles that made America great in the first place. That doesn't mean celebrating every single moment of Americans' history, which is often the democratic response is, oh, what about slavery? Things like that. I think we can be very introspective and admit that there are bad things in history, but as long as we're always taking a step in the right direction based on fundamental principles, that's the way civilizations last. Yeah. And I think things like corruption, for example, things like selling off your own ideas for your own gain, which is something, for example, many politicians do. It's about finding people who care about principles and then rallying around those people and those principles.
Awesome. So you would agree with that, a republic specifically would be best in the hands of moral people?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to an immoral society?
I know, a republic as opposed, what would be the option instead of
just like a republic, if a people is moral or a people's not moral, does that affect the way a republic acts? Or?
I don't think it's really anything to do with the people. I think people are inherently immoral. I think we're not very far from cavemen where we would happily batter each other to death for like a piece of food. When things go wrong in history, like if you look all over the world, things only have to go ever so slightly wrong for people just to turn into animals. So I think sometimes in the West we have this image of ourselves being just above that. We're very much not. Like people went crazy over toilet paper when there was a slight shortage. People can lose their minds really quickly. I think it's about the system and it's about the principles underlying that system. I don't think it has anything to do with the people.
All right, thanks so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Craig Nakagawa from Randolph Lincoln Academy in Front Royal, Virginia. And my question is, with the media leaning left and silencing the people on the right, how can we speak out and have our voices heard in such an important time in history?
Well, I think there's two parts of that. The high-level answer is just to engage with as much as you can conservative outlets like the Daily Wire, but there are many, many others who are building sort of exterior infrastructure to actually engage in terms of news, in terms of commentary, outside of the more kind of traditional system, because trying to get on cable TV, for example, OAN being kicked off, it's very, very hard to do that if you own your site. There are still things that can be done. But then there's also the community level where going back to what I said in the speech, we look to others to make change, but you can affect change just by finding people who are willing to engage, willing to discuss things. You don't have to convert them on the first day, but just being a face of conservatism that isn't the crazy nutbag image that they're presented by the media, I think can do a lot. Because when people see that, they see you as a reasonable person, and then they see the kind of propaganda that's being pushed out there. There's an alarm bell in their head of this isn't accurate, because we're very good at making everything about ourselves. And if you can see someone who is counter to an example being presented, you don't then believe the propaganda. If you've never met a Republican, then you'll believe whatever you're told about them. But if you say your next door neighbor is a Republican, you know them to be a moral person and a good person, then you see someone, oh, all Republicans are Nazis, you're not going to believe that. So you can affect that change just by engaging with people who want to be engaged with, and then trying just to spread not even conservatism, but just the moral face that conservatism has.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Afternoon. My name is Grace Riley from Yucaipa, California. Now, I saw that you worked for the Daily Wire, and I was wondering, well, I do have two questions. So question number
Okay.
one, what advice could you give someone who would be interested in the future working for the Daily Wire?
So I think the answer to that is the same as the answer of what happens if you want to go into just political commentary or political news generally. And I think the key thing is just to put yourself out there in any way you can, but in a very intentional way that's looking to the future. So a lot of younger people, if they want to make a splash in this world, will just make a sensational video about something that's not really that factual. They'll just try and go viral, whatever it takes. There are very dangerous routes you can go with that if you're just desperate for attention. And so I think one is to make sure that you are picking a set of principles that you are promoting and adhere to those, and don't just flush them down the toilet if it'll get you like 100,000 views on YouTube, for example. And then there's also the issue of where you just got to be very, very, very careful, because you have a lot of responsibility, but you also have to understand not knowing something. I think that's something a lot of people who rush into it do not understand, is that at all times in our life, we really don't know that much. So I'm still learning things every day, and I've been doing it for quite a long time. There are people who've been doing it much longer than me who still don't know things. And I think it's embracing that and trying to provide people with information with that as an understanding. So you've got a lot of young people who go on Instagram and just mimic what someone else smarter than them has said, and then they try and get attention through that, but it's just all a layer on nothing. It's really a facade. And so I think it's trying to develop the knowledge, provide people with information. That should be your goal, because then people will grow to know you as a source of information, even if this is just on a blog. And that is far more valuable than going viral, but really having no substance. And so I think that would be my advice. And then that will come in terms of moving then to work for a company. A lot of those opportunities will come once you have that knowledge. You don't go to a company and then learn how to do it. I think you have to kind of learn how to do it first, and then you'll transition that way.
All right, thank you. My second question, so this is a little more complicated. Earlier, we were having a discussion on freedom and what the definition of freedom is, and I personally think freedom has a very moral background to it. Now, do you think it's possible that one reason why we have lost so much freedom in America as a country is because a lot of people have become more atheist in thinking, so a lot less religious? Do you think that could be one reason why we are losing freedom?
I think that's certainly a part of it. I think a lot of it, though, is I think you can be an atheist and still respect freedom and still respect responsibility. I think it's easier if you're not. So I think it's definitely a factor, but I think another factor which I think is almost easier to change is the fact that if you don't want to take responsibility, if you don't want to be a grown-up, if you don't want to stand on your own 2 feet, then freedom is, by definition, going to fall apart. And I think convincing someone to be a grown-up is easier than convincing someone that God exists. And so I would try and focus on things that are a bit more broad, because I think certainly atheism is a huge issue there, but that's a harder problem to solve. Like if you just do not believe that God exists, it's going to be a much harder win to convince them that God does exist in some form than to convince them that regardless of what you believe about God, you should take responsibility for yourself and your family. I think even animals understand that, right? So it's a basic issue that you are kind of the last defense around something that you value. And I think playing to that emotional, like I don't really like appeals to emotion, but playing to that deep emotional thing that we all have would be easier for you to then make gains in terms of promoting freedom.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adrian Flores. I'm from Trinity Pacific Christian School. And my question is, do you think gun rights are the largest contributor to mass shootings in the United States?
What do you mean in terms of like the fact that we have.
The fact that in the United States, like the majority of the population owns weapons.
I don't think that really has a lot to do with it. If you look at just the pure number of guns in the United States, it's like a vast number. We truly don't know how many guns are in the United States. Statistically, mass shootings do exist, but they're also statistically very, very rare. The problem is with the nationalization of the media, where you look at things, isolated incidents, and you have such a broad population that it seems like it's happening all the time. But statistically, it's not. Like if you look at some European countries which have very, very strict gun rights, mass shootings still happen. But because there are fewer people there, it just doesn't happen as much. And so it seems like it's happening less. And so I don't really think gun rights are a problem there. In some way, I'd say gun rights are the solution. I think a lot of this is we don't like to have two unfortunate conversations, which is one is that violence is a unfortunate consequence of any weapon existing, because there are some people who are simply unhinged and want to hurt people, whether that be with a gun or any other object. And two is the fact that gun rights, as Ukraine is showing us right now, give you the only real ability to defend yourself against tyranny, against individuals who want to harm you. And so I think if we look at the statistical likelihood of, say, being attacked by someone in your home, it's far more likely than a mass shooting event happening. And so just on a math level, on a moral level of what the country was built on, I think it's just wrong on every single level to say that gun rights are the main cause of mass shootings. Guns are, because guns are a tool used in a mass shooting. It's impossible to argue against the fact that if you took away all the guns, they just clicked your fingers, they evaporated. Of course, mass shootings would go away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the good thing to do, because there are consequences to that. And also, you take guns away, these violent people are still there, and they still want to harm people. You have terrorist attacks in London where people just drive off the street with a bus or a truck. So you're not going to affect the evil that's in this world by taking away other people's freedom that saves far more lives than are harmed in mass shootings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ian. I'm
Hi.
Jamie Hahn. I work for Young America's Foundation. This is going to be our last question of this session. So I was wondering, because we've learned about Ronald Reagan so much this weekend, and he was widely loved by the American people, but heads of state across the globe feared him. So do you think it's better for a leader to be feared or loved?
I think that's too much of a binary system to put on any leader, because a good leader is someone that's very complex, because people can be good leaders for different reasons. I think there's an element of fear on the foreign policy front that is needed. I don't think you need to be feared as an individual. I think you need to be aware that there are consequences for actions. Like the reason Putin is invading Ukraine right now is because he believes that there are no consequences, or that the consequences are worth what he will gain, which is adding Ukraine to his list of countries that he'd like to envelop into Russia. And so I think you need an element of fear. It kind of turns my stomach, the idea of loving elected officials. Like, they work for us. It's kind of gross when people stand and applaud for politicians, honestly. I even find it weird when people stand up for an elected official when they come in the room. They work for us. And so I think I'm going to reject the loved part. I think respected in terms of their morals and what they stand for, I think is obviously important as a leader. But I think on a domestic front, you need the moral, principled level. On the foreign policy front, I think it's all about fear, because it's literally just a bunch of people fighting with sticks, just with nuclear weapons instead. So I think in terms of foreign policy, it's much more important to be feared than loved, whatever that means. And then on the domestic policy front, I think it's important just to be a moral leader and to have a set of principles that you truly believe, not someone like Joe Biden who changes his principles every 5 minutes based on what the Democratic Party wants.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.